In the most luxurious mansion in a small American town, a simple maid, with calloused hands and dreams kept secret, spent the entire night scattering red roses throughout the most beautiful room in the house. Each petal represented a fragment of the affection she hid, an impossible love she would never dare confess. She believed that this gesture, even if secret, would be silent proof that her presence might one day be noticed by the man who dominated her thoughts, the young, powerful, and inaccessible millionaire, owner of a smile capable of illuminating the coldest of winters. But when the sun rose, cruel fate showed its bitterest face. It was not she who woke up in his arms. Another woman, with expensive perfume and a look of possession, took the place she had silently dreamed of. And the moment the door opened and her eyes beheld that scene, something inside her died, leaving only the cold of injustice and the flame of what was to come. She closed her eyes for a second, trying not to collapse, but the sound of the woman's laughter echoing through the room tore at her soul like a blade. It wasn't just pain, it was confirmation that the poor would always be invisible, even when they gave their hands and hearts. However, fate never forgets those who love in silence and suffer in silence. In that moment of humiliation, something inside her awakened, not open revenge, but a silent force that would transform her life and forever change the course of that mansion. The millionaire, without realizing it, had lit a spark he could not extinguish. And when the truth came out, when the secrets hidden among those roses were revealed, he would understand too late that the invisible woman was the only one capable of breaking the cycle of lies and appearances that surrounded him. But until then, her heart would be tested in fire, pain, and silence. If this story has touched you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share your opinion in the comments. In the vastness of an American city, where skyscrapers competed for space with glass and marble mansions, there was an upscale neighborhood surrounded by high walls and discreet security guards. There lived millionaire Ethan Crawford, a young man, heir to an oil fortune, possessed of a magnetic presence and a gaze capable of commanding respect and desire at the same time. Ethan's mansion was the scene of parties, business deals, and secrets. But it was also the place where a young maid named Grace worked silently, tending to the invisible details that sustained the luster of that life of excess. Grace was not just another maid. There was a rare delicacy about her, a watchful eye that perceived what no one else saw, a heart that bore the scars of the past, and a silent faith that, even in an unequal world, there could still be room for true feelings. That night, the mansion was preparing to host a special occasion. The master was returning from a business trip, and everyone expected a lavish reception, worthy of his name and fortune. Grace had been tasked with decorating the master bedroom, one of the most imposing spaces in the house, with views of the illuminated gardens and curtains of imported silk. She decided to go above and beyond what was asked of her. With the little she had saved in envelopes in her hidden drawer, she bought fresh red roses. She scattered petal by petal on the white bed, forming a delicate path leading to the center, as if the entire room breathed love. Every gesture, every detail, conveyed not only obedience to her work, but a secret desire she hid from everyone, that one day this man, so distant and unattainable, might see in her something beyond a simple uniform and tired hands. The hours passed, and the early morning silence filled the marble corridor. Grace finished her task with a sigh, and before leaving, surveyed the room, illuminated only by the soft lights reflecting off the petals. It was a picture of perfection, a setting that seemed to cry out for something beyond luxury. It cried out for truth, for feeling. As she closed the door, Grace took with her the hope that when her boss entered, she would feel something different, even if she couldn't explain where that special atmosphere came from. But fate, always cruel to those who love in silence, was preparing a scene that would tear her heart apart. When day broke and the sun flooded the mansion, Grace walked down the hallway to fulfill her routine. But what she found was not the dream image of a millionaire surprised by roses. Instead, there was muffled laughter coming from the bedroom. She stopped, her body stiff, her heart racing. As she pushed the door open, her eyes filled with involuntary tears. Between the sheets, it wasn't she who lay in Ethan's arms. She was another woman with an intense perfume, perfectly styled hair, and a look of victory, as if she had claimed a throne Grace had never dared to claim. In that instant, something inside her broke. Secret love turned into silent pain, hope turned into an invisible wound, and the roses she had so lovingly scattered now seemed to mock her naivete. Grace closed the door slowly, her breath ragged, and descended the stairs silently. No one would notice her pain. No one would know of the love that never existed in the millionaire's eyes. But karma, patient and inevitable, was already beginning to write the lines that would transform that humiliation into the beginning of a story of poetic justice. The day went on as if nothing had happened, but inside Grace every second was torment. She walked through the mansion with firm steps, holding back the tears that burned her throat, while the other employees commented on their boss's special visit. Everyone knew Ethan was accompanied by a woman, but only Grace had witnessed with her own eyes the scene that had crushed her hopes. The whispers in the hallways said she was a well-known socialite, someone from the same circle of wealth and power as him, as if fate were always ready to remind her that she could never compete. Grace tried to remain invisible, but inside her heart screamed. In the kitchen, the sound of pots and pans and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the murmur of the maids discussing their guest. Beautiful, sophisticated, she seemed made for him, said one. Of course, a man like Mr. Crawford would never look at a simple maid, added another. Grace, silent, washed dishes with trembling hands, trying not to let her feelings spill over into tears. The muffled laughter of younger women who noticed her distant gaze was crueler than any words. They mocked not only her humble condition, but also what she kept secret, the silent love she had for her master. That morning, while everyone else was busy, she was called to bring coffee to the master bedroom. Her heart raced, her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't refuse. Balancing the tray with trembling hands, she climbed the stairs slowly. Each step was a battle against the memory of the previous night. When she knocked on the door, she heard Ethan's soft voice asking to come in. When she entered, the room still carried the scent of roses, mingled with the scent of the woman. Ethan was sitting in the leather armchair, wearing only an open white shirt, and the woman, still lying on the bed, eyed her disdainfully, as if she were an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. Grace approached, placed the tray on the side table, and, before she could leave, she heard the words that froze her soul. "Thank you for your service, Grace, you may leave." It wasn't just the phrase itself, but the tone he used, cold, automatic, as if she were just part of the mansion's furniture. Grace felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Everything she had done, all the affection hidden in the scattered petals, was invisible, irrelevant, cast into the darkness of her insignificance. Her eyes welled up, but she kept her head down, turned on her heel, and left without looking back. The hallway seemed longer than ever, and the mansion's once imposing walls now closed in on her like a golden prison where only a few had the right to be loved. That night, alone in her small room at the back of the property, Grace wept silently. Her tears fell onto the worn pillow, mingling with thoughts of anger and a hidden desire for life to give her at least one chance to prove herself worthy of more than the condition she had been born into. She didn't want open revenge. She didn't wish to destroy anyone. What she longed for was only justice, for someone, someday, to see her for who she truly was, and not just as the maid. Outside, the mansion glowed with golden lights, luxury cars parked at the entrance, and Ethan's life continued to be shrouded in glamour and appearances. But in the silence of the maid's room, a new force was ignited. It was like a seed germinating amidst the pain, an invisible promise that the story would not end. There. Grace didn't know it, but fate was just waiting for the right moment to return, petal by petal, all the silent love she had given without receiving anything in return. And when that moment arrived, the same mansion that now caused her pain would witness the relentless force of karma. The following days were a silent trial for Grace. The mansion felt colder, not for lack of luxury, but because every corner carried the memory of what she had seen. The roses, already wilted and gathered, had left a trail of pain within her. But something had changed. For the first time, Grace was no longer just the invisible maid, but a woman discovering an unexpected strength within herself. She began to move differently, more firmly, more aware that her life could not be limited to serving unseen. Ethan continued his luxurious routine, surrounded by guests, dinners, and business dealings, and the woman who had slept in his bed constantly appeared at his side. Her name was Victoria, an elegant figure, always draped in designer clothes and with a calculated smile. She walked through the mansion as if she were already Mrs. Crawford, treating the servants with disdain and demanding obedience without even a word of thanks. Grace, however, watched silently, her watchful eyes capturing what many missed. Behind her beauty and confidence, Victoria hid boundless ambition, and her every gesture revealed that her presence had nothing to do with love, but with interest. One afternoon, while discreetly cleaning Ethan's office, Grace found papers Victoria had left on his desk, company documents, stocks, and financial transactions. She realized that the woman was not only close to the millionaire out of affection, but also had an eye on his business dealings. The maid kept this discovery to herself, not daring to speak out. Who would believe her? To everyone, Victoria was the perfect companion for a man like Ethan, while Grace was nothing more than a maid. But deep down, something told her that the truth would eventually come out, and that it would be at that point that silent justice would begin to manifest itself. The humiliations, however, continued unabated. During a dinner party, Victoria, with her haughty gaze, pointed at Grace in front of the guests and said sarcastically, "It's incredible how dedicated she is. It's as if she loves this house more than we do." Laughter erupted around the table, and Ethan, distracted, didn't notice the pain the remark caused. Grace simply lowered her head and collected the dishes, but inside, she swore to herself that she would never allow that woman to destroy her dignity. The pain of humiliation transformed into something new, a silent determination that one day, somehow, the difference in worlds would be balanced. That same night, while the mansion slept, Grace stepped out into the gardens. The wind swayed the trees, and she gazed up at the starry sky, with eyes filled with tears, but also with renewed hope. She spoke, softly, almost like a prayer, "If I am invisible to the world, may fate at least see me." It was a simple but sincere request. In that instant, as if the universe had heard her cry, a twist began to unfold. Small pieces began to move silently, and Victoria, without realizing it, was already taking the first steps toward her own downfall. Grace didn't know it, but someone in the Crawford family, far from view, was beginning to notice her, not because of her uniform or her status, but because of her sincere gaze and the strength that shone through even amidst the pain. Fate, relentless and patient, had already chosen the stage for the great turnaround, and every humiliation suffered would be returned unexpectedly. The mansion, which once seemed only a scene of suffering, would soon become witness to the cruelest lesson Ethan and Victoria would ever learn, that a pure heart cannot be scorned without paying the price. The weeks passed, and little by little Victoria's presence in the mansion began to leave deep scars. What had once seemed enchanting and new was turning into minor discomforts. The servants, always discreet, commented among themselves that the new lady of the house lacked the same respect or generosity as Ethan. She gave harsh orders, demanded unnecessary luxuries, and often treated Grace as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were his own shadow. "Bring me water now," he would say, without even looking her in the eye, as if speaking to someone without a soul. And Grace, still wounded, obeyed silently, but each word etched in her mind like a scar. The millionaire, however, was beginning to feel the weight of the choices he had made. Victoria was beautiful, yes, but there was no sweetness or complicity in her. Their conversations always revolved around money, business, and social connections. One night, during an intimate dinner, she spent over an hour talking about investments and how Ethan should redirect part of his fortune to a venture in which, curiously, her brother was a partner. Ethan, tired of her insistence, rested his elbow on the table and sighed deeply, as if realizing for the first time that perhaps he didn't know this woman that well. Grace observed everything from afar, never interfering, but her intuition made her see what Ethan's eyes still refused to accept. Victoria wasn't there for love. She saw the cold looks the woman gave when she thought no one was noticing, the calculations behind every gesture, the rush to establish herself as the chosen one before the millionaire could even realize it. It was as if Victoria wanted not only his bed, but his social position, his power, his prestige. And Grace, though invisible to her boss, understood every sign as if reading a story written between the lines. One day, during an important meeting at the mansion, Ethan asked Grace to prepare the living room for investors. When she slipped in to set the table, she heard Victoria on the phone, speaking in a low but urgent tone. "Don't worry, he'll transfer the funds soon. They're almost in my hands. After that, you know what to do." Grace paused, her heart racing, but pretended not to have heard anything. This confirmed her suspicions. A trap was being set, and Ethan was at the center of it. Fate, however, has silent ways of manifesting itself. That same night, one of the contracts Victoria was pressuring Ethan to sign ended up being tossed aside due to a missing legal detail. Irritated, she let her frustration out so clearly that even the millionaire noticed. "You're strangely involved in this, Victoria," he said, his gaze more serious than usual. She smiled, trying to hide it, but the suspicion had already been planted. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine, but with each passing day she felt the mansion transform into a stage for something greater. The roses she had scattered in that room now seemed to have been the seeds of a story that would not end in silence. Justice was approaching, and even if she didn't yet have the courage to act, the universe was already pulling the threads that would reveal the truth. Ethan, though blinded by Victoria's charms, was beginning to feel the emptiness of his choice. In moments of solitude, he would walk the halls of the mansion and, without realizing it, notice the discreet details Grace had left, the way the house was always impeccable, the almost maternal care for each space, the silent presence that brought balance. He couldn't put a name to it, but there was something different in the air, as if silent loyalty held more value than the practiced smiles at his side. And so, between lavish dinners and tense meetings, Victoria's mask was beginning to crack. Grace, the invisible woman, could already sense that fate was moving toward her, setting the stage for the moment when the truth would finally emerge, not as open revenge, but as the purest reflection of karma. Mornings at the mansion once again filled with appointments and meetings, and Victoria seemed increasingly present in Ethan's decisions. With calculated skill, she insinuated herself into business conversations, suggesting changes, pushing for risky investments, and always finding a way to connect his interests with those of her own family. Ethan, accustomed to being respected, began to feel a subtle unease. There were times when he found himself wondering if his choices were truly his own or merely reflections of the sweet words Victoria whispered in his ear. Grace, always discreet, watched from afar. She noticed the way Victoria smiled only when there was an audience, and how her gaze hardened when she thought no one was watching. The maid's heart ached, not only because of her secret love, but because she saw clearly the trap forming around her master. Silence was her only ally. Who would trust a simple maid against a woman who exuded confidence and luxury? Yet in every gesture, Grace left traces of care, the hot tea on the E. Days Ethan returned dejected, the perfect organization of his documents, the gentleness with which she made the mansion's spaces welcoming. One night, after a tiring meeting, Ethan walked through the nearly empty kitchen. He found Grace still awake, tidying up details no one would notice. She was surprised to see him standing silently in the doorway watching her. For a moment, his gaze softened, as if he realized there was something in this young woman no amount of wealth could buy. True. Dedication, without ulterior motives. He said nothing more than a simple good night, but his voice held a kindness she hadn't heard in a long time. Grace smiled slightly, and that moment, however brief, was etched in their memories. Meanwhile, Victoria pressed ever harder. She talked about resort investments, large money transfers, projects that could double Ethan's fortune. Although he tried to remain rational, he felt trapped in a web he couldn't escape. There were nights when he lay beside her, but he felt alone, empty, as if he were handing over his life to someone who didn't share his values. And amid this silent solitude, Grace's shy smile began to appear in his mind with surprising frequency. One incident, however, changed the atmosphere in the house. During a formal dinner, Victoria blurted out a phrase that sounded like venom. "You need to learn to trust me, Ethan, without question. After all, everything I do is for our future. Or would you rather continue to be surrounded by people who don't know what power is?" The words hung heavy in the air. The millionaire didn't respond immediately, but his eyes hardened. For the first time, he realized Victoria wasn't talking about love, but about dominance. Grace, who was serving at the table at that moment, felt the mood shift. Her heart raced. Something told her the truth was close to emerging, but that the path would still be painful. As she cleared the plates, she briefly met Ethan's gaze, a mixture of weariness and questioning in it, as if searching, even unconsciously, for a truth she could only find in the purity of someone like her. That night, in her simple room, Grace lay in silence. She closed her eyes and remembered the roses she had scattered around his room, the dream shattered by seeing him in the arms of another, and the humiliations she had endured. But unlike the previous days, her heart wasn't just wounded. There was a spark of strength there, a certainty that time would bring all that was hidden to light. She wouldn't need to fight or scream. Fate would show her that, invisible as she was, her presence carried more weight than Victoria's false glow. As the mansion slept, Ethan tossed and turned in bed, restless, unable to find peace. For the first time in a long time, the image of his own life seemed empty, and deep in his heart began to rise the doubt that would change everything. Was he with the right woman? Or was there, in the silence of the hallways, someone who had already given him more than any promise could offer? The atmosphere in the mansion began to slowly shift, as if an invisible wind were blowing, bringing omens of something greater. Victoria, who had until then maintained her impeccable poise, began to reveal her true nature. Her patience waned with each passing day. Her voice became harsher, and her demands, once masked by seductive smiles, were now clear orders, often laced with contempt. It was no longer about conquering, but about dominating. To Ethan, it began to feel like chains. He no longer saw her initial charm, only a constant pressure that drained his energy. One afternoon, during a business meeting at the mansion itself, Victoria rudely interrupted one of Ethan's partners, trying to impose her opinion. The awkward silence that followed was broken only when Ethan, with unusual firmness, asked her to leave the room. Her eyes flashed with hatred for a second, but she quickly forced a smile and left, her heels clicking against the marble with restrained violence. It was at that moment that the men present exchanged discreet glances. The perfection Victoria had been portraying began to crumble in front of witnesses. Grace watched everything silently, as always, but inside her, a mixture of pain and hope intertwined. On the one hand, seeing Ethan suffer under Victoria's clutches tore her apart. On the other, it was as if the universe were slowly opening a breach for the truth to come out. In every detail, she noticed the signs, the more frequent fights, his weary looks, the lack of genuine smiles. It was like watching a luxurious house crack at its foundations, about to collapse. The breaking point was approaching, and he arrived at a private dinner. Victoria, already irritated by Ethan's resistance to one of her suspicious investments, let out words that cut through the air like blades. "You're strong, but you're naive. I'm what keeps you going, Ethan. Without me, you're nothing more than a rich kid with inherited money." The words echoed like a slap. The millionaire was silent for a few seconds, but the look he gave her was the coldest Grace had ever seen. In that instant, something inside him shifted. That same evening, Ethan went for a walk through the mansion's gardens, seeking air away from Victoria's suffocating presence. As he passed through the side entrance, he found Grace discreetly gathering flowers from the garden for simple arrangements. She was startled by his presence, but he simply stood there watching her work, with an almost sacred delicacy. For a few seconds there were no words, only the contrast between the woman demanding and the woman offering silently. It was Ethan who broke the silence, murmuring, "You always do that, even when no one asks." Grace lowered her eyes, unsure of how to respond, but a slight blush on her face betrayed that those words were more than a comment. They were an acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Victoria, in her room, stared at her. Reflection in the mirror with pent-up fury. The mask she wore was beginning to weigh her down, and the feeling of losing control was eating away at her. Her ambition, once hidden, now emerged with force, and she was willing to do anything to avoid being replaced. Her next actions would no longer be just venomous words, but actions capable of putting everyone at risk. On that silent night, the mansion seemed to carry within its walls the weight of the approaching choice. On one side, the woman, who represented luxury and power, but concealed manipulation and greed. On the other, the invisible maid with simple hands and a sincere heart, who never asked for anything, but gave everything in silence. Ethan didn't understand it yet, but karma was already moving. Victoria's fall would be inevitable, and Grace's rise would come not from a desire for revenge, but from the balance that fate always demands. The mansion, once the setting for sophisticated dinners and celebratory evenings, now seemed to harbor an invisible tension, as if every wall whispered secrets about to explode. Victoria, sensing the gradual loss of control over Ethan, began to act more boldly. Her eyes, once charming, now reflected unease and desperation. She knew time was running out, and that if she didn't consolidate her position soon, she could lose everything she wanted. The employees noticed the change. The woman who had previously presented herself as elegant and irresistible was becoming increasingly aggressive. She complained about minor details, yelled over misplaced towels, and took her frustration out on Grace, who became the preferred target of her humiliations. "You never do anything right," she would say aloud, even when the young woman's work was impeccable. Grace endured it in silence, her heart heavy, knowing that her anger wasn't personal, but the result of a battle Victoria was waging against herself. Ethan, however, was beginning to see what he hadn't seen before. One night, when he arrived home early from a short trip, he found Grace crying silently in the kitchen after yet another verbal attack from Victoria. She tried to hide her tears, but he approached, placed his hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "I shouldn't treat you like that." It was just one sentence, but coming from him, it sounded like the first definitive crack in Victoria's power. Grace didn't respond, but in that moment, she felt she wasn't as alone as before. Victoria, for her part, couldn't bear the thought of losing the control she believed she had over the millionaire. She decided to take more risky measures. At a gala evening organized by Ethan to seal an important contract, she approached one of his most influential partners and, with insinuating smiles, tried to convince him that it would be better to negotiate directly with her. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. Ethan watched from a distance, and although he didn't make a scene, the ice in his gaze betrayed his disappointment. For the first time, he felt betrayed, not only as a man, but as someone beginning to realize the game of self-interest he had allowed himself to be trapped in. Amidst this turmoil, fate began to act silently. A document forgotten on his office desk fell into Ethan's hands. Investment reports Victoria had insisted he sign were riddled with irregularities, inflated numbers, impossible promises, all pointing to a scheme that could destroy part of his fortune. He didn't want to believe it right away, but the suspicion already growing within him found the proof he needed. Meanwhile, Grace continued her routine resiliently. Even hurt, even humiliated, her presence brought a calm that contrasted with the chaos Victoria had wrought. It was as if, silently, she were the only remaining foundation in the crumbling mansion. Ethan began to see this more clearly with each passing day. When Victoria yelled, Grace remained silent. When Victoria demanded, Grace offered. When Victoria manipulated, Grace simply did what was right. That night, Ethan locked himself in his office with the documents in hand. The sound of the clock ticking away was the only companion to his reflection. The image of Victoria, glamorous and seductive, began to fade in his mind, replaced by the vision of an ambitious and dangerous woman. At the same time, he remembered Grace, with her delicate hands scattering roses, her low voice carrying out orders without complaint, and her quiet strength that made him feel human again. The contrast between the two women had never seemed so stark. Victoria, noticing the change in his behavior, decided she couldn't wait any longer. That same week, she plotted a trip with Ethan, insisting on a romantic retreat away from the eyes of his business partners and family. But her plans hid something darker. The unseen Maid, unbeknownst to her, would once again be a key player in the unfolding of events, as fate prepared the stage where, finally, the truth would be revealed. And so in the tension that hung over the Crawford mansion, karma was already sharpening its blades. Victoria was about to fall into the trap she herself had set, and Grace, even unwillingly, would be the silent witness to the justice that always arrives, sooner or later, to balance what seemed too unfair to remain hidden. The trip was hastily organized, almost as a desperate attempt by Victoria to reassert her dominance over Ethan. The chosen destination was a secluded resort in the Colorado mountains, a place of discreet luxury where politicians and business people sought refuge to conduct business away from the glare of the press. She believed that, away from everyone, she could regain his trust and convince him to sign the contracts she so insisted on placing on her desk. Before leaving, Ethan quickly stopped by the mansion to leave instructions. He inevitably ran into Grace in the hallways. He found her in the library, stacking books that the guests from the last reception had left out of order. For a moment he paused at the door and watched her silently, and the scene touched him more than he cared to admit. She was there, in the same simple uniform as always, but there was a care in the way she arranged the books, almost as if each gesture were a silent form of love. When Grace noticed him, she straightened quickly and murmured, "Have a safe trip, Mr. Crawford." He responded with only a slight nod, but as he left, he carried with him the strange feeling of leaving, behind something much more real than what he would find at his destination. At the resort, Victoria put on her best facade, smiles, rehearsed caresses, conversations about the future. But what seemed like seduction to her felt hollow to Ethan. The millionaire couldn't shake recent memories, Grace's teary eyes, the calm in her voice, the contrast between her simplicity and Victoria's artificial sophistication. Over a candlelit dinner, he finally confronted her. "Victoria, do you truly love me, or do you love what you can get by being by my side?" Her smile faltered for a second, but quickly regained its composure. "I love what we can build together, Ethan. With me, you will be greater than you've ever been." Her answer, though eloquent, sounded like confirmation of what he feared. There was no affection, only ambition. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Grace went about her daily routine. But something in her had changed since his departure. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, even if only in her thoughts. Not a future with the millionaire, but a future where she would no longer be invisible. Walking through the gardens at night, she felt the cold wind touch her face and whispered to herself that she wouldn't always be the woman she silently loved. It was a quiet promise, but one filled with power. In Colorado, tensions rose when Ethan, tired of the pressure, refused to sign a contract Victoria was forcing on him. "I won't risk my fortune for something I don't trust," he said firmly. Her gaze darkened. For the first time, there was no charm or gentleness, only suppressed fury. "You'll regret treating me like this, Ethan," she muttered, before standing and leaving the room. The threat hung in the air like poison, making him uneasy. That night, alone in the luxurious resort room, Ethan closed his eyes and, instead of thinking about Victoria, saw Grace in the mansion's hallway, sincerely wishing him a safe journey. A simplicity that was worth more than any jewel, more than any promise. He wasn't sure what it meant, but deep down, he felt his life was beginning to take a different direction. Victoria, however, had no intention of giving up. On the contrary, her determination to achieve everything she wanted intensified. Little did she know that the seed of her downfall had already been planted, and that Ethan's heart, though still confused, no longer belonged entirely to her. The memory of Grace, silent and distant, began to shine brighter than any artificial light Victoria could turn on. Returning from Colorado didn't bring the peace Victoria had hoped for. On the contrary, it was as if the mountains had only highlighted the growing distance between her and Ethan. During the drive, the cold stares, the veiled arguments, and the weight of the silence between them already made it clear that something had broken. When they arrived at the mansion, Victoria got out of the car with a straight face, but inside she was burning with rage. She knew she was losing ground, and that if she didn't act quickly, she could be replaced by someone invisible to the world, but increasingly present in the millionaire's heart. In the days that followed, Victoria's mask began to crack irreversibly. During a private party for some investors, she drank more than usual, and amid forced laughter, blurted out words that sounded like venom. "Ethan would be nothing without me, everyone knows that. He needs someone who knows how to manage him, or he'll sink with the inherited fortune." The comment reverberated like a dangerous whisper among the guests. Some smiled politely, but the exchanged glances betrayed the perception that Victoria was nothing more than an ambitious woman trying to grab what wasn't hers. Hearing this, Ethan felt bitter shame, not just for the veiled offense, but for having allowed that woman to get so far into his life. He left the party early, leaving Victoria to explain herself amidst the murmurs. In his room alone, he remembered the trip, and inevitably remembered Grace. Not the moments when she simply worked, but the moments when her discreet presence made the mansion breathe. He remembered the look in her eyes when she wished him a good trip, the way she endured humiliations without ever failing to fulfill her role with dignity. The comparison was inevitable. On the one hand, a woman who lived on appearances. On the other, a woman who offered truth in silence. Grace, for her part, also noticed the change in the air. The employees whispered about the constant bickering between Ethan and Victoria, and some were already wondering how long their relationship would last. She kept to herself, tending to her tasks, but in her heart something blossomed, not as a romantic hope, which she tried to stifle, but as the certainty that the truth could not be hidden forever. It was as if the universe was slowly stitching together the justice she had never dared ask for. Fate, ever. Patient found another way to expose Victoria. One morning, while Ethan was reviewing documents in the office, he received a call from one of the partners who had been pressured by her. The man's tone was clear. If Victoria continued to interfere, they would withdraw from the negotiations. It was the final blow. Ethan hung up the phone and remained silent for a few minutes, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. He no longer needed further proof. Victoria was not a partner, she was a liability. But what truly unsettled him happened soon after. As he left the office, he encountered Grace in the hallway, balancing a tea tray. He offered to help her, something unthinkable months ago, and when their hands touched for a brief moment, Ethan felt the genuine warmth in that simple gesture. Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but in that moment, he felt the difference between a suffocating presence and one that held. That night, Victoria sensed Ethan's irreversible coldness. She tried, in vain, to regain lost ground with promises and rehearsed caresses, but he no longer reacted. The millionaire was beginning to free himself from the web she had woven, and her every false move only drove him further away. For the first time, he not only doubted Victoria but craved distance, and amid the emptiness she left, the memory of Grace rose like a flame, warming the chill in his heart. Karma advanced like a silent river, and Victoria, unknowingly, was already heading toward her inevitable downfall. What she grasped so tightly slipped through her fingers, and each desperate gesture drove her deeper into the abyss she had dug herself. And in the background, always invisible but ever more present, was Grace, the woman fate had chosen as the symbol of all that is true, even when the world insists on despising her. Victoria could no longer hide the instability growing within her. The fear of losing her place at Ethan's side consumed her, and every attempt to maintain appearances ended. In arguments or public humiliations that eroded her image in the eyes of everyone, parties were no longer invitations to admiration, but stages of suspicious glances and hushed comments. Her every slip-up echoed like another crack in the facade of perfection she had worked so hard to maintain. At a gala evening held at the mansion itself, tension reached a new level. Victoria, already intoxicated from too much wine, approached Ethan amidst the guests and pressed him in front of everyone. "Are you going to sign those contracts or not, Ethan? How long are you going to pretend you don't need me?" The silence that fell after her words was deafening. Some guests looked away, others whispered among themselves, and Ethan, visibly embarrassed, simply walked away without saying anything. It was the final blow to cement her downfall in the eyes of high society. The woman who had once paraded herself as a symbol of power was now seen as a desperate figure, clinging to a man who was beginning to openly reject her. Grace, who was discreetly serving at the party, witnessed everything. Her heart raced, not out of pleasure at seeing Victoria exposed, but because she sensed the situation could become dangerous. She knew the looks of despair well, having seen them in people about to lose everything. And in Victoria's eyes there was more than anger. There was a promise that she would not go down without a fight. Grace feared what was to come, but remained silent, watching from a distance, as always. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion became almost suffocating. Ethan avoided Victoria's company, retreating to his office or taking solitary strolls through the gardens. During these moments, he inevitably ran into Grace. Her small gestures, like leaving a hot cup of tea on his desk or organizing his papers without being asked, began to take on an unexpected weight in his life. He said nothing, but increasingly he realized that there was a comfort in her presence he couldn't find anywhere else. Victoria, on the other hand, plotted in silence. She knew she was losing control, and that time was running out. One morning she was seen at the mansion's gate, talking to an unknown man in a low, nervous tone. The servants commented but didn't dare question her. Grace, however, caught the scene and felt a chill. Something was about to happen, something that could hurt not only Ethan, but everyone living under that roof. Ethan, increasingly suspicious, began investigating on his own. He reviewed contracts, called partners, and analyzed documents. The deeper he delved, the more he realized the depth of the trap he had nearly fallen into. Victoria didn't just want his fortune, she was ready to destroy him if necessary. One night, exhausted after hours of reading, he leaned back in his office chair and closed his eyes. The image that flashed through his mind wasn't of Victoria, but of Grace, discreetly arranging library books before her trip to Colorado. Her simplicity now haunted him, becoming a beacon amidst the darkness of his life. Victoria, realizing the irreversible distance, decided to take decisive action. In her room, in front of the mirror, she muttered to herself, "If he thinks he can discard me like this, he'll learn the hard way that no one rejects Victoria Hale." Her eyes burned, and her hands trembled not from fragility, but from rage. From that moment on, her every action would be driven not just by ambition, but by the desire for revenge. Karma, however, was already moving silently. The mansion, which had so often been the stage for appearances, was about to witness its first great downfall. And in the center of this turmoil, Ethan began to understand something he had refused to see until then. That the woman who brought him peace was not the one the world expected by his side, but the invisible Maid whose sincere heart had been with him from the beginning, albeit in silence. The Crawford mansion seemed to breathe an eerie silence. The servants paced the hallways tensely, as if sensing something dark was about to happen. Victoria, always impeccable and haughty, now appeared with discreet circles under her eyes, her steps quicker and her gaze even sharper. No one dared question her, but everyone knew she was up to something. Grace, sensitive to every detail, noticed the way Victoria withdrew into late-night phone calls, her voice always low and urgent. The plan unfolded one rainy night. Ethan had been invited to a business dinner at a luxurious hotel in the city. Victoria insisted on accompanying him, but he firmly refused, saying he needed to go alone. Her refusal was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Determined to show she was still in control, she arranged a meeting with one of Ethan's rivals, an unscrupulous businessman known for financial fraud. Grace, walking through the mansion's foyer, overheard part of the conversation. "This is the chance to bring him down. I'll deliver the documents he won't sign, then he'll have no choice." Grace's blood ran cold. She knew this could ruin her boss's life, but how could a simple maid stop it? Meanwhile, Ethan, alone in his office, reviewed important paperwork. With each page, his mind returned to what he had discovered. Manipulated contracts, suspicious figures, Victoria's name appearing in places it never should. He no longer had any doubts. The woman who had enchanted him was also the one trying to destroy him. The pain of this realization was profound, but there was also a strange relief. It was as if the chains were finally breaking, allowing him to see clearly the truth that had been before him all along. The storm outside seemed to mirror the silent battle within the mansion. Grace, distressed, couldn't sleep. She paced her small room, remembering the words she'd heard. She felt the need to do something, but feared being ignored, or worse, accused of making up lies. Still, her heart told her that silence was no longer an option. At dawn, she summoned courage and discreetly left a simple note on Ethan's desk. "Be careful who you say is by your side. Not all roses are fragrant. G." She didn't sign her full name, but the note carried the essence of her soul. Sincere, discreet, true. When Ethan found the paper, something in him snapped. He immediately recognized the handwriting, recognized the metaphor, recognized the silent origin of that gesture. He put the note in his pocket, saying nothing to anyone. But deep down he felt that Grace was the only one who saw beyond appearances. From that moment on, his steps became more cautious, and his attention redoubled. Victoria, unaware that her plot was already leaving trails, intensified her plan. The next day she arranged a private dinner at an expensive restaurant with her rival businessman, bringing copies of confidential documents. The meeting, however, didn't go as she'd hoped. One of Ethan's security guards, suspicious of her activity, discreetly followed her. Footage of her handing over the documents was recorded, and within hours they were in the hands of the millionaire himself. Upon seeing the recording, Ethan felt a mixture of fury and sadness. He had not only been deceived, but almost betrayed in his honor and his business. From that moment on, Victoria's mask was officially off. He said nothing immediately, preferring to keep the evidence hidden and wait for the right moment to act. And as the internal storm grew, the memory of Grace's note returned to him like a beacon of truth amidst the chaos. Victoria believed she was still in control, but she didn't know that fate was already working against her. Karma, patient and inevitable, was about to reveal its power. And the mansion, the scene of so much silent pain, was preparing to witness the turning point that would transform humiliation into justice. The atmosphere in the mansion was heavy, as if the walls sensed that the truth, long hidden, was about to be exposed. Ethan, now with the evidence in hand, paced his office feeling the weight of betrayal. Images of Victoria handing over confidential documents burned in his mind, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face smiling calculatingly. But along with that image, the memory of Grace's note also surfaced. Simple words, but charged with a truth no one else had dared to tell him. That morning, he called Victoria in for a chat. She entered the office with her usual haughty air, confident she could still manipulate the situation. Ethan said nothing at first, simply placing the envelope containing the photos of her meeting with her rival businessman on the table. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Victoria's face paled, but she quickly regained her smile. "You don't understand, Ethan. I did this for us to ensure your business wouldn't be harmed." But her voice trembled, and his gaze no longer revealed fascination, only coldness. "You betrayed me, Victoria," he said finally, his tone low but firm. "Not just as a woman, but as someone I trusted. You nearly destroyed everything I built." The words echoed like a verdict. Victoria tried to reach out to touch him, but he recoiled. "Don't try again. It's over." Those 3 words fell on her like stones. Grace unwittingly became a witness to that moment. He was passing through the hallway when he heard Victoria's voice, almost in despair. "You'll regret this, Ethan. No one knows you better than I do. No one will love you like I could." Grace shivered, but continued on, unnoticed, her heart racing at how close she was to the downfall of the one who had humiliated her so much. Victoria left the office with a firm stride, her eyes blazing. The employees watched her cross the hall and realized something had changed. The woman who had once seemed unshakable was now merely a figure marked by imminent defeat. Some exchanged discreet glances, and for the first time no one hid their silent relief. Ethan alone sat and took a deep breath. For the first time in months he felt he had regained control of his life, but deep down he knew he wouldn't have gotten this far without that quiet warning, without that quiet courage of someone who sought nothing in return. Grace's note remained tucked away in his drawer, like a charm of truth amidst the lies. Victoria, however, did not give up easily. In her fury, she began spreading rumors around town, trying to tarnish Ethan's reputation. But each attempt seemed to only reinforce her own downfall. Her associates, already suspicious, shunned her. Society, once enchanted by her presence, now regarded her with contempt. What remained of her prestige crumbled before her eyes. Meanwhile, Grace remained silent, performing her tasks with the same dedication as always. But inside her, something had changed. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just an invisible maid. Not because someone had praised her in public, but because I knew that her voice, even if whispered, had made a difference. Fate, patient and relentless, was already setting the final stage. Victoria was about to face the outcome of all her choices, and Ethan, finally free, would begin to see that true strength had always been at his side, in the simplicity and truth of someone who never asked for anything, but always offered everything. Winter was descending heavily on the city, and the Crawford mansion, surrounded by gardens now blanketed in snow, seemed to reflect the silence of a new beginning. Victoria no longer walked the halls as the mistress of the place. Her presence had dissolved like smoke after the revelation of her actions. Abandoned by her associates, scorned by society, and rejected by Ethan, she had left in a hurry, carrying only suitcases full of designer clothes and the fury of someone who refused to accept defeat. But the world outside was even crueler. Doors closed, invitations disappeared, and her once brilliant image became synonymous with scandal. The woman who believed she had conquered everything ended up alone, tasting the poison she had cultivated. At the mansion, life resumed its rhythm, but with a different lightness. The servants, previously tense with Victoria's presence, now worked serenely. Ethan, for his part, dedicated himself more to business, righting wrongs, repairing alliances, and restoring his credibility. But deep down, something else occupied his mind, the awareness that the invisible foundation of his entire home was not made of marble or contracts, but of the silent presence of a young woman who never sought recognition. Grace continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She cleaned, tidied, and organized with the same dedication as always. But inside her, there was a mixture of relief and confusion. She had endured humiliations, seen her dreams shattered, and yet she hadn't given up on being true to her beliefs. Now, as she walked the halls, she noticed that the looks on her face were different. They no longer saw her as just the maid. Something in her demeanor, in her quiet strength, had earned them respect. One evening, after a long day of work, Grace walked through the snow-covered gardens. The cold wind bit her face, but her heart was warmed by the feeling that fate had somehow balanced the scales. It was then that she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Ethan, wrapped in a heavy coat, watching her with a different look. There was none of the arrogance he once carried, but the gentleness of someone who had learned a lesson. "Grace," he said quietly, almost as if afraid to break the silence of the night. She lowered her eyes, ready for an order or a formality, but the words that came next surprised her. "Thank you for everything. You saw what I didn't want to see and saved me from losing much more than money." Grace tried to respond, but tears filled her eyes before she could get any words out. He continued, "I always thought value lay in brilliance in appearances, but it was in silence that I found truth. It was you, invisible to the world, who showed me that." Grace felt her heart race, but maintained the humility that had always accompanied her. "I only did what I thought was right, Mr. Crawford." Ethan smiled slightly, and there was more sincerity in that gesture than she had ever imagined. There were no passionate declarations, no promises of immediate love. What happened that night was something greater, the recognition that the true heart of a home is measured not by wealth, but by unseen loyalty. Grace returned to her simple room, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt whole. As the months passed, the mansion flourished again. Business prospered, and Ethan became a more cautious man, less enchanted by appearances, and discreetly he increasingly sought Grace's company, not as employer and employee, but as someone who finally saw her for who she truly was. The hallways that had once been the scene of silent tears now witnessed small moments of restrained tenderness, a look, a shy smile, a gesture of gratitude. Victoria, somewhere far away, continued her downfall. Newspapers reported her bankruptcy. Her name was whispered with contempt, and those who once surrounded her now shunned her. Fate does not forget, and what is sown in error blossoms in solitude. At the mansion, however, a new story was beginning to be written, not one of luxury or scandal, but of quiet redemption. Grace, the young woman who scattered roses throughout a room and watched another woman dawn in the arms of the man she silently loved, was now remembered not for the uniform she wore, but for the invisible force that sustained it all. And Ethan, watching the gardens bloom in spring, knew he had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of his life: never underestimate a true heart. Thus, karma was fulfilled. The woman who sought victory through power fell to her own fate. The woman who never sought anything found in silence the recognition she deserved. And in the contrast between wilted roses and reborn flowers, the Crawford mansion bore witness to the eternal truth. Justice may be delayed, but it always arrives, and when it does, it transforms pain into dignity. If this story touched your heart, leave a like to support our work, subscribe to the channel to follow new stories full of emotion and justice, and share your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you would have done in her place. And don't forget, there's another amazing story already appearing on your screen. Click and continue living this experience with us.